Hello, Bitcoin Basics listeners. Thank you for joining us. So what we have here is a series that I did for a local radio station in New Zealand called Fix the Money, Fix the World. Some of you might recognize that phrase. And what I've done is just gone through basic highlights of what's happening in the economy and how it actually affects the everyday person. So we've just uploaded those to the Bitcoin Basics podcast. Thank you, Gordon, for doing that. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
The following podcast is a live recording of a radio show first broadcast by FreshFM with assistance from New Zealand On Air. FreshFM is a community access media station based in Te Tauihu, the top of the South Island, New Zealand.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Fix the Money, Fix the World. I am your host, Faris Mali, and we are going to be talking today about bank bailouts. So we've just had some news come out of America. They've got a large bank there, Silicon Valley Bank, that essentially has gone bankrupt. And this is following on the news of Credit Suisse as well, which is a huge European international conglomerate bank. This I'm bringing to your attention because it's shadowing what happened in the 2008 financial crisis when we had Bear Stearns that went bankrupt and they were let to go bankrupt. But then Lehman Brothers, which was bailed out by the taxpayer, and followed by Lehman Brothers, we had other bailouts of American Insurance Group and 5 other huge banks in America. If you have not seen or read the book, Too Big to Fail, I highly recommend it. And I've also mentioned William Cohen's book, House of Cards. These are really worthwhile reads if you want to know how these huge banks spending money, losing money affects you. Because what is a bank bailout? Well, what it actually means is the government, and when I say the government, you always have to remember that means you, the taxpayer, is paying these out. And this is what's happened in the case of Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse. They have lost billions of dollars, and the taxpayer is going to pay for their mistakes. And this is reminiscent of what happened in 2008 when these huge banks went bankrupt, should have gone bankrupt, but didn't because the government, your elected representatives, stepped in and gave them hundreds of billions of dollars, almost, I think, over $1 trillion in the end, to pay for their mistakes. So we're going to be talking about that a bit today. To begin with, we are going to start with a song. That was Wild Then. So we are talking about bank bailouts today. And the reason I want to bring this to your attention is because we've had a couple take place recently, and that might not sound like big news, but Credit Suisse is a huge bank. The Silicon Valley Bank in America is big as well. And the problem that we're seeing is there are several banks in the United States and that are over-leveraged and basically in a lot of debt. Now, I'm going to take you back to 2008. I have spoken about this in a previous episode, so we're just going to do a recap. But essentially what's happened is that when we had these banks that over-leveraged, and what does leverage mean? It basically means you borrowed more than you can pay back. That's essentially what it means. You borrowed a lot, and these banks simply did, when the margin loans came in, they didn't have the money to pay things back. So instead of going into bankruptcy, which is what should have been done in my opinion, they were bailed out by the government because they wanted to contain the contagion, as I said. So they gave the analogy of a wildfire, and you need to stop it from spreading. I might come back to the wildfire analogy later. Now, what have we had since 2008? So when we actually saw the Lehman collapse, that was a big one. The domino that triggered was Bear Stearns, the first bank to go under. Then they prevented Lehman from going under. They bailed them out. Then you saw a lot of large banks being bought out by even larger banks with government money. So the government used your money, the taxpayer, to bail out these private banks. It actually got pretty sick in that when Lehman got bailed out. So the problem that they had was they're selling these mortgage-backed securities, which essentially were home loans, car loans, student loans, all rolled into one. And they're selling those as products. So you could own someone else's car loan and their obligations. So these products made them a lot of money, but when they all went under, the bailout that they got from the government actually paid for these bankers as bonuses. So they created these products. These products failed. These products were insured by AIG. AIG ended up having to get a bailout. So the very products that they created, the very demon that they created, which caused a global financial crisis, not only were they bailed out for creating this product, but they still got paid their bonuses for selling these products. So this was actually, I don't know if you heard of this, but this actually kind of made the news in America. It's like, hang on, how are we paying these guys bonuses for the problem that they caused? The equivalent would be if an arsonist started a fire in a building, not only does he not get prison time, everyone else pays for the damage, and you're handing the arsonist cash for the fire that he started. I'm not exaggerating that that's what happened. And from what I've read, and this is yet to be confirmed, but apparently this I know is confirmed, Silicon Valley Bank, which went under last week in America, was supposed to go under, but has been bailed out. Executives sold $5 million worth of shares just the week before. And apparently on the Friday before, they actually handed out bonuses as well. So this is a problem that we're seeing, is that it is this disrespect for consequences, or the fact that they can behave as if there are no consequences. 2008, this was a signal that you sent, was that you cannot fail. Because if you do, the Federal Reserve and the taxpayer will come to your rescue. This created this created waves in 2008 when we had the Stop Wall Street movement. That's basically what this was about. We, the taxpayer, should not be paying for their selfish, overzealous, and greedy mistakes. And if you have not seen the original film Wall Street, I recommend you see it. There's a great line in there where Charlie Sheen's character asks Michael Douglas's character, Gordon Gekko, how many yachts can you jet ski behind? And Gordon Gekko, his statement throughout the film is greed is good. And look, I believe in free market capitalism, but it has to come with consequences. And what's happened is we've removed the consequences of greed from private bankers and people who they will affect everyday people. So private bankers whose decisions and actions, overzealousness and greed, making as much money as possible, when they are affecting the everyday economy, there are no consequences. Not one person from the global financial crisis went to jail or faced a fine. They all got bailed out. And now we're seeing the same thing happen again. Silicon Valley Bank, Credit Suisse, these bankers are being bailed out by taxpayers for the mistakes that they made. Now, we want to go a bit deeper and say what's different between now and what led up to 2008. So what's happened since 2008, and I've actually talked about this in a previous show, is we've had an injection of liquidity. Fancy way of saying we just gave you free money or very cheap money. So banks have had for 10 years have had access to cheap money where you can borrow things at very low interest rates. Now, what has this actually led to? So we've seen a bubble in all forms of asset classes. So leading up to 2008, you had a huge asset bubble in real estate. Everyone was basically throwing their money into real estate. Real estate did very well. Now we've had this in all things: the equity, the stock market, old watches, heritage watches, art. I mentioned before Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia paying $450 million for one Da Vinci painting. We've just seen the fact that money has been so cheaply available. People are borrowing that money. Corporations are borrowing that money and buying assets with it. So we've had this huge bubble in assets. And that looks like it started to roll over. But the problem this has led to is we have, since 2008, 2009, we have reached the lowest level of bankruptcies, corporate bankruptcies in America. So I'll repeat that again. The lowest level of corporate bankruptcies. Now you think, well, that's a good sign. It means you have a healthy economy. Not necessarily the case. Because what's happened is that you've had a huge amount of companies called zombie corporations, where the way they work is that the only way these companies are still operating is by borrowing more money. So money's cheap. You can borrow at 2%, or it used to be 5-6%. Borrow at 2%, and what's happened is that a lot of companies in America, instead of making a profit and living off of a profit, they haven't been able to do so, so they'll borrow more and borrow more and borrow more. It actually got to a stage where 80% of the companies in the Russell 2000, and the Russell, you might have heard of the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ 100. So the Russell 2000 is a composition of the 2,000 middle companies in America. So the S&P 500 is the top 500 companies in America. The 2000 is the 2,000 after that. So 2,000 companies in America. 80% of them were classified as zombie corporations, meaning if they did not get a loan that month, they could not operate. They'd have to go under. And we saw this just not change. So the reason we have low bankruptcies is arguably that they did not go bankrupt, but borrowed more money because money was cheap. But what have we seen in the last 12 months? Interest rates going up. So now we're starting to see these bankruptcies actually start to take place because these companies cannot pay back those loans with new debts because interest rates are going up. So they're declaring bankruptcy. So bankruptcies are now on the rise. So the 2008 financial collapse basically led to cheap credit. Companies borrowed, they bought assets, they're selling those assets. So we've had about a year ago, we had a huge amount of insiders in the top 500 companies selling their shares, selling their stock. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, was one of them, I believe. He actually resigned recently. He sold his shares. I did read that the CEO of Moderna, he resigned recently. The same week he resigned, seized all his social media, and cashed in $400 million worth of shares. I read that, but I would like to confirm that, double check that one. So we're just seeing these companies basically cash in, and now we're starting to see bankruptcies on the rise. So the problem that we've had is if we allow the central banks and the government to step in and bail out these banks like we did in 2008, what is the lesson? Take as much risk as you want. Play with this money. It doesn't matter. We're here to back you up. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. This is Fix the Money, Fix the World, coming to you on FreshFM Monday mornings and sponsored by myprivacy.help. Do you live online or interact, do any sort of banking or anything online that might be sensitive? Do you know who's controlling that information? Because everything you do on your phone or on your computer is stored on someone else's computer. myprivacy.help will help you regain your privacy in your life. All right, guys. So today we've been talking about bank bailouts. We had a couple of instances over the week where two large banks have been bailed out yet again. This is reminiscent of what we saw during the financial crisis of 2008. And the reason it's important is when we talk about governments bailing out, government is you. They are using your money to bail out banks that should have, in my opinion, let be bankrupt. Because what is the problem? And just treat it like you have your own kid. If any of you have children, they don't do their chores. Do you give them their allowance? No. What happens if they don't do their chores and you give them their allowance anyways? Is that going to be an incentive for them to do better next time? No. As human beings, we are naturally greedy, lazy, efficient, however you want to describe it. I like to say efficient. And what will happen is if your kids don't do their chores, they'll get paid. They won't do their chores and expect to get paid. And it'll be harder for them to turn around once that habit is kicked in. So unfortunately, what we saw in 2008 and what led to the global financial crisis, the policies have not changed. We are now bailing out banks for poor decision making. And that does affect everyone. I highly recommend a book by Michael Smith. Michael Smith is an excellent person to read. He writes about the markets, but he is an excellent writer. He's written a couple of books that have made it into film, The Blind Side and Moneyball. These are his non-economic finance books, but the one I'm thinking of is called Boomerang. And this is how culture affects how we deal with money. Fascinating book to read, that one. So he actually goes around countries and visits countries that were affected by the financial crisis. Greece, Greenland, Italy, Germany, United States, and looks at and Ireland, and looks at how did the culture affect the way they handled money. And unfortunately, we are living in a culture where I believe we've lost respect for money. And we are just seeing bailouts and a lot of stimulus. And this is the problem that we have, is that when a government says it's free, it is not free. Whenever a member of your government says it's free, it's not. They're not paying for it, but you are. So I believe, my personal opinion is that they see, it's just a few dollars for every taxpayer. It's nothing. That adds up. The more debt you have, the longer it takes to pay back. And we have now seen huge amounts of debt being accrued by G20 nations, and it is growing and growing, and there is no plan for them to pay it back. Absolutely none. There was Christine Lagarde, who was head of the IMF and then the Euro. So this question was actually proposed to Christine Lagarde. Christine Lagarde was head of the IMF and then became head of the European Central Bank. And I'm just going to play this interview. It's on YouTube, and I will link it.
There is this graph about the balance sheet of the European Central Bank and the money that is on there now. And here it is. What I would like to show our viewers and ask the question about is, this is going over 8 trillion euros now.
I'm just going to interrupt there. When they say balance sheet, they're actually talking about how much the bank owes. So this is a European Central Bank, and this is what they owe. So this is bonds that they've paid out that they owe.
And isn't what you just told us about the cryptocurrencies, don't we see a gigantic bubble here on your balance sheet with the euro? And isn't this graph very nerve-wracking?
Well, I can tell you that there is 0 crypto assets in the balance sheet of the ECB.
That I know.
Point number one. Well, I just don't want any ambiguity about it.
Yeah.
But you have to think in terms of counterfactual. If we had not decided on March 18th, when we put together the pandemic emergency program and then subsequently increased the volume of commitment that we made to the European Union economies, we would be in a devastated situation. So I don't regret any of that move that we took on that day, which was 4 months into my job, to significantly increase the size of the balance sheet, because that's all we had.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the economy would have collapsed, and it would have been even accelerated by a financial crisis.
You had to do it. It was the COVID crisis. You say that's
yes.
what we needed to do. But how do you get it?
It will
back?
come. It will come. In due course. Yeah.
How?
In due course, it will come.
Yeah?
No,
but do you
because
sleep at night when you see this?
Of course I have to sleep at night. And I have to worry every morning.
Yeah, okay.
So this journalist was actually asking a question. Fair enough. The European zone is in a lot of debt. How are you going to bring it down? Her response was in due course. Now, in due course to me means we do nothing different and it will change. That's what Einstein described as insanity, is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So here we have someone who is controlling the money supply of Europe with no response. How are you going to bring the debt down? No response whatsoever. So if anyone out there actually has any suggestions for Christine Lagarde or any other central banker, they'd love to hear it, because they don't know. All right, I need to go to another song, and then I'll come back and just bash everyone else who allegedly is smarter than me. We are now going to listen to Fluorescent Adolescent by the Arctic Monkeys. That was Fluorescent Adolescent by the Arctic Monkeys. If you are just tuning in, we are towards the end of the show, where I've basically been knocking central banking government policies when it comes to their economic and financial decisions of bailing out private companies. In that last clip that I just played by Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank, she said we have zero exposure to cryptocurrencies. So the question before that was about cryptocurrencies and the fact that it wasn't a bubble. That bubble has actually since come down. One thing I'd like to mention is that no government has ever bailed out an investor for losing money in cryptocurrency. If you are investing in that, you should know full well you can lose everything that you put in. Has as happened to many people that I know. They just went a bit too involved, lost money. The taxpayer's not going to bail them out. That's your mistake. If someone lost money and they went to their neighbors and said, I lost money, I want you to pay me back, you'd think they're insane. You won't have anything to do with them. But the government is doing this with your money to private banks. This is what's happening in America, in Europe, is that the private banks are being greedy, over capitalizing, over leveraging. And what's happening? The taxpayer is bailing them out. This is what happened in 2008, and they're doing it again with Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse recently. And this is adding to the balance sheet what governments owe. And when I say governments, it's you, it's your future kin. They owe this money. And when asked, how are you going to bring this down? How are you going to bring your debt down? They do not have a response. So, on that very positive note, thank you for tuning in. Please, if you have any questions, anything you want me to cover, please go to farismali.com. That's FarisMali.com.
The podcast you just listened to was a live recording of a radio show, first broadcast on Fresh FM, the top of the South's community access media station, with support from New Zealand On Air. The funding of Access Media makes these podcasts possible. To find similar programs by other community access media stations, go online to accessmedia.nz. If you or your group would like to know more about how you can have a program on our station, please contact us. Visit our website freshfm.net for our contact details.